Kia ora tātou, everybody. Bruce Harrell's my name. I'm the director of the Goodfellow Unit, and it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome Professor Robin Dunbar, who's a professor of evolutionary psychology from Oxford University in the UK. He's best known for the social brain hypothesis, and more importantly, the Dunbar number, which he will tell us about tonight. This is the limit to the number of meaningful relationships you can have with at any one time. So, Robin, hand over to you. So thank you very much for your generosity.
A great pleasure as always. Right, so I'm essentially going to talk about the work we've been doing on friendship, but with a kind of particular emphasis really on its effects on health. So I'm going to start right with that in some sense to kind of highlight the importance of why you should have friends, why friends matter. And I think that what has been a surprise in the woodwork in the last decade and a half at the most has been the huge amount of evidence that's been published, much of it prospective epidemiological studies on huge samples of the effect of friendship on health and well-being generally, not just physical health, but mental health as well, and also survivorship into the future. So how long are you going to live from today, as it were? And here's one of the nicest studies I know showing exactly that. It's a meta-analysis of nearly 150 studies of essentially heart attack patients. And I like it because it's a very, very hard-nosed criterion they're using. Obviously, most kind of psychological and epidemiological studies often use questionnaires. How well do you feel today? How happy do you feel today? This is, have you survived 12 months after your first heart attack? So it doesn't come any more hard-nosed than that. The burden of these results, though, is summarized here. These are the effect sizes, so the impact, if you like, of different things that you may have characterized you prior to or after your first heart attack. And you can see on the left the two big bars. One is network quality. That's a composite of both the number of close friends you've got and the quality of those relationships, and that comes out tops by a long way for most things. But giving up smoking as is, it's good for you, basically, is the short answer. But all the other things that your friendly neighborhood GP worries about on your behalf, like how much activity you do, how much alcohol you consume, how obese you are, what drug treatments you're on, how many McDonald's beef burgers you have a week, what the air quality even in the place where you live. These are not unimportant, but they really come way down the list. And if you want to avoid that second heart attack, clearly the best thing to do is to have some friends. And we carried out a very big follow-up study, used two waves from a very big epidemiological study from 13 European countries. So it's both widespread and very large. And it was looking at the risk of depression symptoms or symptoms of depression in the future. And this is the burden of the results. Your risk of depression is minimized if you have about 5 friends. It increases as you have fewer friends, and paradoxically, you might think it increases as you have more friends. Turns out, interestingly enough, that you can substitute friends for voluntary activities. So the optimum seems to be 3 voluntary activities or 5 friends, or you can kind of mix them. But what you cannot do is add them together. And I think the reason is related to the fact that the number of friends effect. So what voluntary activity is doing is putting you in a social environment where you meet people and talk to people and have a coffee with people and perhaps do something after your session at the charity shop or whatever it may be that you're doing. And the problem is, in order to have close friends, as I'll show you in a minute, you need to invest a lot of time in them. And therefore, if you have more than 5 friends or more than 3 voluntary activities, or you try and have 5 friends and 3 voluntary activities, you just spread your social capital too thinly to have relationships of a strong enough quality to affect your, in this case, risk of depression, your psychological well-being. So you might ask, in some sense off the back of that, well, can you actually have an infinite number of friends? The answer is no. These are data from phone call records, so it's the entire phone call logs for one mobile phone provider from one very large EU country. The has 6 million subscribers, representing about 20% of the entire population. And what's plotted here is the distribution of the number of people called in a year. So we're excluding all the kind of free phone numbers and, you know, calls to your stockbroker and your baker as best we can, mainly by requiring a phone call to a particular number to be reciprocated. So they have to call you back at least once to qualify as a meaningful relationship. But here's the distribution. The number of people called in the year on the bottom there is on a log scale, you'll have noticed. So, you know, there are some folk like Bruce who are incredibly social and know, gosh, maybe 5,000 people in their phone book. But then at the other end of the extreme, there's Billy No Mates like me, who only has about 20 people in their phone book. So there is a big range here, but you can see the typical value, and that's that yellow smear is the actual data. The black dotted line is just the normal distribution fit of that. But you can see the average and the very strong peak here is around about 150 people. And that's the number that's known as Dunbar's number. So I should point out it includes family, as extended family, as well as friends. And typically in the modern developed world, and this is based on data we collected mainly from Britain and from Belgium on the continent, that will consist 50-50 of family, extended family members and friends as we would have them. But if you come from a very large family, and you know, many people even in these countries do, but obviously it's more common in developing countries with a more traditional lifestyle, as it were. If you have a big extended family, then you have fewer friends. It's very, very characteristic. But that number keeps popping up all over the place. Here's just a few examples. The top there, the size of weddings in America. So this is a 10-year compilation of the number of wedding guests at American weddings. The average is 145. The size of hunter-gatherer clans, which reach local communities, as they're called sometimes in Africa, clans in Australia usually, comes out about 155, and that's a sample from right across the world. Size of all modern armies, the company is around about 160 on average. It varies from about 120 in the British Army to about 180 in the American Army, and everybody else is pretty much sandwiched in between. And then last but not least, because they didn't anticipate this and they hadn't heard of me at that point, but the Doomsday Book, which was the record of this first census that William the Conqueror did when he grabbed England and Wales, which he did obviously to find out how much tax he could raise, but records very nicely pretty much everything about every single village in England and Wales, and a parallel version from the Italian Alps, which is actually across 600 years, from about 1200 to about 1800, of village sizes up in one alpine valley up there. Both of them produce an average village size of about 160 people. So this seems to be a very, very characteristic number, and you just keep coming across it all over the place, both in business and in, as you might say, real life, as it were. So sometimes I get asked, well, you know, surely Facebook has changed all that. That's what they promised to do. The answer is no. These are data collated by Stephen Wolfram, who's has made a living out of analyzing Facebook data. Facebook allows you to have up to 5,000 friends. So that's the range on the bottom there. There's a tiny little yellow dot at 5,000. They're mostly professional users, but the actual distribution of number of friends on Facebook is the big yellow peak on the left. And that he simply observed, and this was back in about 2005, 2006, that the typical value is somewhere between 150 and 250, which is about what you'd expect for people, the main users of Facebook, who are typically late teens and early 20s. But I think the most convincing evidence, if you like, was a paper published just about 10 years ago now, which sampled 61 million Facebook pages, and the average size was exactly 149. So it doesn't come any closer, I think. I always say I'm going to go and collect the $200, and I'm going to buy both of Abramovich's yachts on the strength of that. This number is really dictated by your brain's capacity to process information and manage information about relationships that you have. It was originally predicted from an equation relating the size of social groups in primates to their brain size, or in particular the neocortex size, because that's the neocortex, the bit of the brain that's expanded out of all proportion during the course of primate evolution. But since then, there've been, well, actually, we're pushing probably about 20 neuroimaging studies, including 3 on monkeys, and all of which show that the best predictor of social network size, measured in all sorts of different ways, including how many people you contact, how many people, in one spectacular Korean study, they asked not how many friends do you have, but they asked everybody else in the village, are you friends with so-and-so, and worked out your real friends, as it were, on the basis of what other people thought of you rather than what you thought of them. But what they all basically come up with is the number of friends in this sense, including family, that individuals have is highly correlated with the size of what turns out to be the default mode neural network, which is illustrated in the bottom brain graph. It's this enormous white matter bundle that connects the prefrontal cortex, in particular up on the left-hand side there, with the parietal temporal junction on the sort of opposite corner on the right-hand side, and down through the temporal lobe. And then there are linkages down from the prefrontal cortex into the limbic system, the amygdala, and also into the cerebellum at the back of the brain. So it's a huge, huge chunk. But the size of that correlates very strongly with the number of friends you have, and seems to, as I sometimes inclined to describe it, really what it allows you to do is to manage relationships in the sense of a juggler. So the bigger the bundle of neurons, or the bigger the computer you've got, in effect, the more balls you can keep in the air without dropping them. And dropping them means making faux pas and saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, or asking the wrong person to do you a favor. Okay, but your friendship circle looks not at all like the image on the left-hand side, which is probably Glastonbury or some such pop concert venue. It looks much more like the one at the bottom. It's very clumpy, and in fact, if you look at the frequencies with which people contact each other, or indeed the frequencies or the emotional sense of emotional closeness they have to particular individuals, it works either way. What you get is this sort of highly structured series of layers, whereby you sit in the middle of the circles. I'm trying to describe it a bit like the waves or the ripples that occur when you throw a stone in a calm lake. As you go out, the ripples get wider and wider, include more and more people, but the height of the waves gets shallower and shallower. So that's the emotional quality of the relationship, and the frequency of contact gets less and less and less. So what's interesting about these is these layers consist of very, very specific numbers, which have a very specific relationship to each other. They have a scaling ratio of approximately 3, so each layer is 3 times the size of the layer inside it. But these layers count cumulatively, so the 15 layer includes the 5 people in the inner circle, as it were. You get to 150, that's your friendship circle, essentially. It also defines the people who you would be genuinely altruistic towards without expecting a return. So if they ask you a favor, you out of a sense of obligation, and bearing in mind what other people within your social circle might think of you, you will say yes. But beyond that, relationships become much more transactional. So we know these layers go out for another 3 layers, one at 500, one at 1500, one at 5000, and 5000 is defined by the number of faces you see that you know whether you've seen them before or not. You don't know who the people are necessarily, but you know whether you've seen them before. So it really demarcates strangers. So everybody beyond 5000 is complete stranger. We can put names, as it were, to these. So the 5 in the inner circle is the best friend. We sometimes call them the shoulders to cry on friends, because they're the ones that will drop everything to come and pick you up when your world falls apart. As you go further and further out, people are less willing to do so, to pay such a heavy cost for you, but they will do so. It's just they won't drop the baby and come and sort you out, as you might say, but they will come once they've sorted the baby out. But once you get, as I say, beyond the 150 to the acquaintances layer, things become much more transactional. Well, yes, I'll help you out today, providing you come and help me out tomorrow, or you pay me some money to do it. Okay. So how do we build our relationships? Well, we do them exactly as primates do. It's what's called by psychologists, the 2 process mechanism. Involves 2 different neural channels in the brain doing essentially complementary jobs. So they work in tandem, these 2 processes. One is based on the stuff you can see in the pictures on the screen in front of you, social grooming, which primates do a great deal of. It's very emotionally intense, creates a very close sense of bonding. And the other is a cognitive component, which really depends on the brain size. This is the social brain component, and it's much more conscious. So the grooming component is, if you like, more unconscious. It's a kind of raw feels effect. The cognitive component is much more explicitly cognitive and conscious, and it's how we build up a sense of trust and obligation and reciprocity to the individuals who do these things with. And we've shown with neuroimaging studies, or at least my collaborators in Finland have shown, that social grooming does exactly what, in humans, exactly what it does in primates. Namely, it triggers the endorphin system in the brain. It's the endorphin system in the brain, which of course is the brain's slow, essentially slow pain management systems, as it were. Endorphins are chemically related to morphine, but sufficiently different, just slightly different chemically, the molecular structure, that you don't get addicted to them in the same way that you get addicted to other kinds of street opiates, but explains why people do get addicted to street opiates, because they essentially producing the same sense of relaxation, calmness, and trust in the individuals who do these interactions with. And here are the results of your brains here, showing the endorphin receptors in the brain just going crazy while the subjects are being stroked by their romantic partners in the PET scanning machine. Brain scanning machine. And I hasten to add, when I say they're being stroked, they're being very casually stroked on the torso only, nothing above the neck or below the belt. And so this is just casual grooming. And of course, it's the kind of stuff we do all the time without really thinking about it. Hugs that people give each other when they meet, casual stroke of the arm or pat on the shoulder, all these kind of things that go on. subconsciously, really, during the course of conversations with people we know. We don't do it with everybody. And in fact, it's actually quite a limited circle we do it with. But the one place that it really does come up is in hairdressing, which is why I have the two pictures of hairdressing on the left there. The constant manipulation of your hair and the stroking that goes on in the course of that releases endorphins. That's why you come out feeling on top of the world. It's not just the lovely haircut you've just had. It's actually the endorphin system produced by the hairdresser. Endorphins are interesting because not only do they produce this sense of relaxation and so on, they're the major basis for social bonding in primates and humans, but also, in addition, they stimulate the immune system, and particularly the natural killer cells in the immune system, which now you can see why there might be a direct physiological benefit in terms of physical health as what, not just mental health. So you're getting the mental health bit from the natural opiates, opioid sense of the uplift you're getting from opiates. But it seems that there is a direct route into the physical health benefits as well. This stroking or grooming issue is really quite important, because we only discovered about 10 or 15 years ago that there's an entire peripheral nerve system that nobody knew about, which manages this, and it's a very unusual system. So it's what's described here as the slow nerve fibers on the left there, the afferent C-tactile neuron system. They're very different to all the other peripheral nerves in the sense that the other peripheral nerves are all fast. They have a return loop. They go direct to the somatosensory cortex in the brain. And so, when you put your hand in the fire, the signal races to the brain saying it's hot, and the signal comes racing back down saying, for God's sakes, pull your hand away. The C-tactile fibers are very, very different. They're unmyelinated, so they're extremely slow. They're one way. There's no return loop. They go to the insular cortex, which is one of the endorphin producing areas in the brain, and they respond to one stimulus and one stimulus only, and that is light, slow stroking at the about 3 centimeters per second. So if you stroke faster than that or slower than that, they don't respond at all. Nothing happens. And we've shown that these same neurons, particularly the ones the inner ear, the cochlea, is absolutely full of these same neurons. And we showed a couple of years ago that this is why rocking babies calms them down, sends them to sleep, and indeed probably why we rock our heads during music. When you do that, you get an endorphin hit from this. Okay, so why is time important in all this? Well, basically, you have to keep investing, particularly in friends. Family relationships are a bit more robust because they're kind of held in a spider's web of interrelationships. But friendships tend to be a little bit more dyadic in their structure in your social network. And if you don't continue to invest in friends at very, very specific rates, the quality of that friendship will decline. So this is a study we did of high school students in their last year, high school, going away round about month 6 here, on the timeline at the bottom, going away to university. So it's normalized to 0 for both at the beginning of the study. So that's the average emotional closeness rated for their extended family and all their friends at about the middle of their last year at school. And you can see that the emotional closeness to extended family, it's everybody out second cousins, basically, is pretty stable. It even goes up a bit. But friendships, because you're not seeing these people, because you're at university in a different city, it's less easy to walk around and bang on their door and say, let's go out and do something. Friendship quality declines very, very rapidly over time. So how do we solve this problem, particularly for our large communities? As I mentioned, grooming, the physical component, really we only do it with about 50 people. After that, it's handshakes only mostly. And the answer seems to be these activities. I sometimes describe these as your social toolkit. These are the things we do with people in general, and we can do them with very, very large groups. So laughter, which we think is very ancient because it's so visceral, it's involuntary, essentially. Singing without words at this stage, and dancing, both of which probably came in about 500,000 years ago with archaic humans. And then once language, modern language as we have it now, evolved in our own species, you have the rituals of religion, feasting, eating, and it turns out drinking alcohol together, and storytellings, all trigger the endorphin system. We've shown for all of these, they trigger the endorphin system. Some of it's been done by PET scanning, some by pharmacologically, some of it just by pain threshold changes. And they all create a sense of bonding to the people you do it with, even if they're strangers. It doesn't have any effect at all on the strength of your emotional strength of your friendship or relationship with your best friends or family. If they're not present on the day, has no effect at all, but it does affect your relationship. You feel very bonded to complete strangers. And singing in particular, we refer to singing as the icebreaker effect, because you can have people do an hour's community singing. So we're not talking about sort of BBC Philharmonic chorus fancy stuff. We're just talking about round the campfire community singing, an hour of that, complete strangers, and they'll come out of that feeling as though they've known each other since they were at primary school together. It's absolutely extraordinary, quite magical. And just to give you some indication of some of the benefits of friendships, this is off a big survey study we did of communal eating. Essentially, it's how often do you eat during the week with other people rather than on your own. We did a parallel one on religious attendance too, very, very similar results. But essentially, the top graph simply shows that the more often you eat socially, the more close friends you have, this inner core of 5. And the more often, again, you eat socially, as the bottom one shows, contrasting just social diners with solitary diners. The more friends, the happier you feel, the less depressed you feel, the more engaged you feel with your local community, the greater trust you have in your local community, and the more likely you are to feel that life itself is worthwhile. So who makes a good friend? Just to finish up, the answer is, as the estate agents might say, it's homophily, homophily, homophily. This is again something that's come out of the woodwork probably in the last 20 years ago that it was first pointed out, but again, huge quantities of data now show that your friends are very similar to you. So homophily meaning love of the same, essentially. These come in 2 kinds: endogenous traits, which are things you can't do anything about. They're your biological and psychological characters, and exogenous traits, on the other hand, which are things you can do something about. They change potentially over the course of a lifetime, and they're strictly cultural. The main endogenous traits are gender. This is very, very striking. So something in the order of 75% of women's social networks consist of women, and 75% of men's social networks consist of men. And the other 25% in each case of opposite sex members are family, invariably, and obviously you can't do anything about them, so you're stuck with them. Ethnicity is very strong effect, and I don't mean by that race, although that's a kind of corner of it. I mean literally, people from the next door valley, whoever they are. So this is, the difference between meeting a South Islander or a North Islander. If whichever you're from, you're immediately warmer to whichever island half of New Zealand they come from. Age, our friends tend to be similar in age to us, and they tend to be similar in personality. It's kind of easy to see why, because it's easier to come to some sort of decision about what to do on Saturday night if you're similar in age and personality. The exogenous ones are the ones that are particularly interesting because we had no anticipation of this at all. And they turn out to be basically 7 dimensions of friendship, which we've termed the 7 pillars of friendship. they are all cultural. We learn them, and we seem to learn them particularly during the later teenage years. And they essentially is defining who we are as a community, which community we come from. So there are things like sharing the same language, or better still, dialect, coming from the same place of origin. We think that's actually growing up in the same place of origin rather than being born there. Having the same, I've put down educational trajectory here, but really it's career trajectory. Same hobbies and interests, same moral, religious, and political views. And the two interesting ones, same musical taste, same sense of humor. And these exogenous ones will trump the ones on the left-hand side. So ethnicity sort of fades into the background if it turns out that actually you share a number of these exogenous cultural dimensions. So these are quite fixed, really, from your teenage years. They do change a bit as you're exposed to new opportunities later in life, of course, but you never quite lose your dialect of where you grew up. So just to summarize, really, human social world is extremely small. That's Dunbar's number. Its size is determined really by the size of your brain and the time you have available to invest in friendships. And that really determines the quality of friendships. And finally, last but not least, friendship really has a very, very strong influence on not just our happiness, but also our physical well-being as well. So I'll stop there, and we can get back to Bruce.
I was talking to Robin earlier on, and I said my interest in this whole area of gender and friendships was when I talked to my oldest friend, who is a woman. She's a child psychiatrist, and she said to me, when I'm with a group of women, we talk about different things than when I'm talking with men. And I was completely blindsided by that. I wasn't expecting that. Of course, I'm not in groups of only women. So what would the women be talking about, and what would the men be talking about, Robin, in general?
I think the bottom line here, Bruce, is the women would be talking and the men wouldn't.
Right.
But this goes back to, I mean, this is sort of, again, one of the things which we had never anticipated when we started off on this research theme some 20 odd years ago, but just completely blindsided us because we kept seeing it, and started to then get interested in what was going on. So essentially what it boils down to is the dynamics of the way relationships are built is actually very different and involves different parts of the brain, in particular, between men and women. And essentially, women's friendships are much more dyadic and one-to-one, if you like. And as you might say, who you are matters much more than what you are, what you do, or what club you belong to. And as a result of that, a great deal of it depends on conversation and the exchange of kind of sort of more emotional, intimacies. In contrast, men's friendships seem to be much more club-like and anonymous. So who you are is pretty much irrelevant. What you are is the criterion. Are you a card-carrying member of my club? And sometimes that can be extremely casual. It's simply the group of guys that meet regularly on a Friday night for a beer. And the criterion is quite simply, can you lift a pint of beer from the table to your lips without spilling it? Or what is very common, I've noticed since being also a member of this particular club, is the men's club that consists of the husbands of my wife's girlfriends. And this is a consequence of women being much more proactive socially, will set about setting up relationships, inviting people around to dinner and so on. And the men sort of have to tag along, and they eventually kind of start talking to each other and suggesting going and doing something. But these men's club-like relationships are very much activity-based rather than conversation-based. So conversation exists only to stimulate laughter, bonding, effectively, or to discuss rather kind of largely uninteresting things that just provide the basis. So is it a football supporters club? Is it a kayaking club? Is it a mountain climbing club? You know, what's the interest of the club? Or is it a group of psychiatrists who meet up regularly for a beer and a general chat, but of course end up talking about their cases?
I'll talk about work. Yeah.
Yes.
Going back to your graph there, the 1.5 with the women with the BFF, and the women have 2 and men have 1. Could you just elaborate on that?
Okay.
That's fascinating.
So this was rather a surprise, actually, because I used to joke about it. You remember the diagram of the layers, the ripples on a pond that make up your social world. And at that time, we only knew about 5, the 15, 50, 150, 500, and so on. And I used to joke that there was a layer missing when I was giving lectures, because if you just count back, you should end up at a layer of 1.5. And everybody would scratch their heads and say, how can you possibly have 1.5 relationships? And I would say, well, it's because half the world has 2 and the other half has 1. Therefore, the average is 1.5. And who are these people? Well, they're men and women. And but didn't take this very seriously until my Italian collaborators, analyzing very large data sets from Facebook and Twitter and other similar sources, kept coming up with this number. And they said, we keep finding this very odd layer at about 1.5. And this is what it turns out to be. Now, the reason for it has to do with best friends forever. So what we found in our data subsequently is that 85% of women have a best friend forever, basically a platonic friend, if you like, and 85% of those are women. That's 85% of, at any one time, 85% of women will have a best friend forever, because they obviously will come and go, and you may have a gap in the middle with no one. But that's in addition to the romantic partner. So they very often have a romantic partner and a best friend forever. Clearly, in most cases, the romantic partner would be a male, but the best friend forever is nearly always a female. And the reason is very clear from the interviews that have been done with women in these cases, because it's just say men are hopeless for emotional intimacies. It's just a complete waste of time. You need somebody else to go to to deal with that side of your life. And it's because males have this more activity-based social world that they live in, which doesn't really involve a great deal of emotional intimacies, kind of thing. But what's interesting is men only have typically one or the other. It's extremely rare for them to have both a best friend forever, a best mate, as it were, and a romantic partner. Those will, a surprising number of those best friends forever for men will be women.
Right. Well, I've been able to operationalize this, and women who are depressed and they haven't seen their BFF for a while, they've stopped seeing them. It's usually a very bad sign. And the first thing I do is get them, look, go and call your BFF. Probably thinks you don't like her anymore because you're not contacting her. So for God's sake, get in touch with her. And usually the BFF is upset that they haven't been in touch, that gets them back in the river of life very quickly. So it's been very useful in that sense. The issue of gender being socially constructed. So a colleague at work said to me, she thought that gender was socially constructed. So what would be your answer to that?
There has been a long-standing argument, clearly, that the difference between sex and gender is one is biological and the other is socially constructed, and there are all sorts of derivative positions that have emerged out of the woodwork in the last decade or two that complicate that. To be honest, I mean, I'm coming at this primarily as a biologist, so I tend to see this mostly in terms of biological sex. But whatever happens, there is a very strong underpinning as a consequence of having 2 X chromosomes. There's absolutely no question about this, and its influence on the nature of the way you work in the social world. And that's tied into lots of other brain components. So men and women tend to process social information in different parts of the brain. They tend to remember different things. About what's very, very common is for a couple to go out for dinner, and when they get back home, the wife says, "Wasn't it terrible? Louisa's story about her sister's auntie's cousin," or whatever it might have been. And the bloke turns around and goes, "What story?" he heard the same conversation, but he was processing it in a very different kind of way, and coming away with a different recollection, as it were. And partly that's consequence of how they're processing it in the brain. Women process these social things out there in a much more complex way than men do. That's very, very clear. They make much more, we see that even in their mate choice strategies, they make much more complex decisions about whom to form a romantic relationship with, for example, than men do. And this partly goes back to the fact that, what keeps friendships going with women is talking together. And our data show very nicely that talking together has absolutely zero effect on whether a man's friend with either a woman or a man will continue into the future. What makes the difference is doing something together. And this is because the male social world is much more activity based. So these processes are there. Now you can tweak them. These are not absolute differences. These are relative differences on a dimension. It's just that in general, women lie at one end and men lie at the other end, and there is some overlap in the middle in exactly the same sense as is the case that on average men are taller than women, but not all men are taller than all women. There's overlap in the middle, but that and that kind of produces somewhat more masculinized women and somewhat more feminized men. And I think that makes it look like you can manipulate gender perceptions in culturally, as it were. And the answer is, well, yes, you can, but not to that extent. You might be able to shift people at the kind of overlap end a little bit further along the dimension towards the other sex or gender, but you're not going to shift them all. Particularly the ones at the two extremes are probably not going to be possible to shift at all. And a lot of that comes out of the fact that these things appear very, very early in life. We actually see exactly the same gender differences in monkeys and apes. So this is very, very ancient in terms of social activity and even the nature of social play. You can pick these gender differences up in social play in kids in playgrounds from as early as the age 5, if not before. And they're very, very constant. This 75%, 25% split in preference for your own gender in social networks, we already see at the age of 5 in children, and it remains absolutely robust across the lifespan. It doesn't change one iota, no matter what your experiences are. But I suppose some of the best evidence for this comes out of the Dunedin study, where they've been following up this one cohort of babies, as it were, for, I don't know, they're in their 40s or 50s now, I think. And what's very clear is some of the extremes, in particular, of behavior are very, very tightly defined by their both particular brain structures that they have and their genetics. And in the case of males, the males that end up in trouble with the law and can never hold a relationship down, and so on and so forth, and are just a perennial nuisance socially to the rest of us. They're already showing those tendencies by the age of 5. It's a one-way trajectory. It seems nothing you can do really can have a major. You just cannot. I mean, you might be able to tweak it a little bit and make them behave a little bit better, but you're never going to be able to get them even to the sort of middle range of, shall we say, the average decent male like you and me, Bruce.
So we've got a supplementary question to my comment. Is it as easy as Operation Get Back with Your BFF? Are there other examples that we could use as GPs, nurse practitioners, nurses?
If you want to sort of know how many friends they have, short of just sticking them in a brain scanner and if you like measuring it directly, as we in theory can do now, I mean, you just have to get them to sit down, list out all the people who they would regularly see at least once a week, because that's the definition of the time definition of that shoulders to cry on layer of 5 best friends, or we've sometimes done it by simply saying, you know, who if your world fell apart, who would you go to for emotional, financial, social, or other forms of support? And the number you get out always is, on average, about 5. So you can pick up the variability across there, because you'll get a range of responses from 0, you know, maybe to as many as 10 people or something of that kind of thing. The average is always 5, and that's your benchmark. So, and that's extremely stable. We get that in all our samples, as it were. So if you want a very, very simple measure, that's a very easy thing for somebody to list in a couple of minutes. And it just gives you a measure of where they lie. I mean, you have to titrate that a little bit with personality differences, because introverts tend to have slightly fewer and men tend to have slightly fewer. So men and introverts will sort of be around 4 to 5. Women and extroverts will be around 5 to 6. The extrovert-introvert difference seems to be that introverts are a little bit risk averse, so they'd rather have fewer friends and invest more time in each of them so that they can guarantee they will work when they need them. Because the problem with this friendship effect on health and so on, and even helpfulness, is you have to have those relationships in existence ahead of time. And, you know, there's a very simple test of that. If you don't believe me, rush out into the street where you live and throw your arms around the nearest stranger you see and you know, say, my world has fallen apart, I need a hug. And even in New Zealand, I dare say, their response is likely to pull their mobile phone out and call either the ambulance or the police. Whereas if you do that to one of your 5 shoulders to cry on friends, you know, clearly what they'll do is they'll put their coffee cup down and come rushing around to.
Well, one phenomenon you do see here, even in a big city, if you're standing on the corner of a big street with a road map out and you look a little bit lost, somebody will come up, which is like a small town thing. But even in Auckland, that will happen. There'll always be somebody come up and say, can I help you? Are you lost? So we're rather kind to strangers in that sense.
If I dare to say so, I think that is characteristic of New Zealand culture.
Well, thank you.
Being kind to strangers, but that's a reflection of the fact you're a small country, and you know, if you look anywhere in the world, the places that like Scandinavia have small countries, you know, they're much more socially cohesive, things work much better, people are much more trusting of each other. They may be a bit shyer in the Nordic countries and less forthcoming if you're looking lost in the middle of Stockholm than might be the case in Auckland. But nonetheless, you know, demography you know, is the cause of most of our problems, I think, because once population size gets very large, it becomes, you know, everybody's a stranger, and you know, you inevitably feel much more threatened by you know, people who don't share many of your cultural icons. And you know, this is very deep psychology. It seems to go back to, you know, hundreds of thousands of years ago, even when we all lived as hunter-gatherers in very, very small communities.
So we've got a question here. You touch upon this about the issue of immigration or emigration. Do you have some information about how long it takes to develop friendships as an adult, for example, after immigration? Any advice? Is there research about it?
I mean, I'm sure there are lots of people who've done research in this area, from a sociological kind of point of view, maybe social psychology point of view. We haven't directly, but one thing we have done is look at the network structures of immigrant groups, because when we were looking at trying to explain the structure of these layered networks that we have, where you have a few very close friends and a lot of less close friends, and we were trying to explain this mathematically, the maths kept producing two answers, one of which said you have a few close friends and a lot of distant friends, and the other answer was you have a lot of close friends, relatively speaking, and very few distant friends, so people in that outer circle between about 50 and 150. And we were very puzzled by this until it dawned on us, probably this is reflecting the size, your social opportunities. So if you're in a context where you can't easily access a large population to choose friends from, what you end up doing is throwing your lot in entirely with your closer friends, because you share more stuff with them, and then not having the outer circles particularly, and that probably characterized immigrant communities in particular, but also almost certainly, I mean, it's certainly the case this characterizes older people. So what seems to happen as you get older, you considerably older than me, I'd like to say.
Well, that's right.
You get into this period of increasing loneliness. So this pandemic of loneliness in the elderly, which has been around for a very, very long time, and has a direct influence on their health and morbidity and mental health and well-being and physical health and well-being, is simply a consequence of the fact that they're losing their network. So the outer layers seem to fall away as you get less mobile and less socially confident about going out. You can't get out so easily, so you don't get around to see people, and therefore what were once friends, those friendships sort of drift away. So you end up losing what seems to be, as we understand it, losing layers of the circles inwards, until you end up eventually, I suppose, if you live long enough, you start at it actually is a U-shaped curve, because you start with about 1.5 very early on, and you add layers up to the sort of late teenage, early 20s, stabilize about 150, and then you lose layers once you're past about 65, 70. So I guess if you live long enough, you end up with just the inner layer of 1.5 again that you started with at the other end of life. So it's just a reflection of that general problem. If your opportunity to meet people is constrained in some way, whether that's because you're housebound, whether that's because you have some learning disability perhaps, and can't interact with people effectively, then your network is going to be much smaller, and it's going to have this kind of reverse structure of a disproportionate number of I mean, you're still probably not having more than 5, but because you don't have the outer layers, your inner layers are weighing disproportionately. And sure enough, that is exactly what we saw in these immigrant communities, some of which had been around for a while. And you can kind of understand the problem, because if you're a new immigrant into a country, you don't have the contacts that you would have had if you'd grown up there, and your access is kind of limited because of the language differences, the cultural differences. You kind of don't slot in. It takes you a long time to acquire that. My guess is, and it's kind of really just a sort of guess on the basis of general observation, is it actually probably takes something close to 3 generations for somebody to become fully engaged and immersed in the local culture, so that you no matter what they look like, as soon as they open their mouth, they're from Auckland. And therefore they must be good people.
So I've got a nice question here. What is the role of a pet? Is petting a cat similar to grooming?
The answer is yes. Now, I didn't mention it, but I sometimes do when I'm talking, that actually your 150 people, and again, you know, sort of, you have to bear in mind the differences between extroverts and introverts a little bit. Introverts, will be somewhere between 100 and 150. Extroverts, somewhere between 150 and 250 in their total circle. Normally, those will be other humans, but they don't have to be. There's no prescription for this. They can be your favorite pets, your favorite horse, or you know, if you're a dairy farmer, your favorite cow. They can be dead people, your ancestors. They can be people in the spirit world, God, the Virgin Mary, a saint. And I dare say, if if you're a gardener, you may have a particularly close relationship with your pet petunia or rosebush that you invest a lot of time in. The issue is, do you feel that you have a meaningful relationship with them? And that depends on you feeling that you have some kind of conversation with them and that they respond in a way which is reflective of that relationship. So although these are artificial, and of course, the other source of those kind of parasocial friends, as they're sometimes called, is soap opera characters. If your particular favorite soap opera that you watch every week, you become so immersed in the life of that story and the characters that you feel you have these relationships. And famously, The Archers was the famous one, the radio series that sort of started in the 1940s, I think, during the Second World War, and still going strong. People actually write into the characters and tell them the secrets of their lives. So it's about feeling you have a relationship. Now, it's obviously better in some sense that is a real person or a real animal, in the sense you're getting some direct feedback, than if it's a kind of virtual person, because you're getting some of the warmth and feedback. And herein lies the issue about social grooming, that physical contact that we are constantly engaging in with people who are our closer friends and family, is triggering the endorphin system. So you're getting your skin, as it were, it's the skin being essentially massaged, if you like, that produces the effect. You're getting that even if you're stroking your cat. The cat is nuzzling up to you and returning it, because we don't think you have any receptors in the bare skin. So the soles of your feet and the palms of your hands don't have any receptors in them. So it's you can only give grooming. You don't get it back yourself at the same time. The other person has to groom you to give you the endorphin kick, as it were. So, but your pet dog or your pet cat will be nuzzling up to you and sitting on your lap and effectively indirectly grooming you in that sort of way. So yes, I think the answer is you're getting all the right signals. In the end, they have all of these non-humans clearly have limitations, because there are things they can't do for you. For example, talk you through an emotional crisis, or kind of say, no, you're really not well. I'll pop home and get you a nice chicken broth and bring it around to pep you up, and these kinds of things, which are clearly important both for your physical and your mental well-being. But they provide a benefit and of some kind, and for those who don't have access to so many people as a substitute, well, there's nothing wrong with it, I think, at all.
Any thoughts about the difference between men only, gender only book clubs versus mixed?
Well, I think in the end there is a sense that comes out of all this, is that both genders are in some ways happier in single sex groups, that somehow those work better. they're more congenial. It's harder work if they're mixed sex. So we see this in a lot of cases. If you look at conversations, and you can see this happening before your very eyes, at things like receptions or dinner parties or the like. And this is a consequence to some extent of the fact there's an upper limit on the number of people that can be involved in a conversation at 4. If you get a 5th person joining a conversation, it'll be 2 conversations within 15 or 20 seconds. So I can absolutely guarantee that. It's extraordinary. But what tends to happen at that point is they become gender specific. So you can have a mixed gender conversation, 2 men and 2 women, and another man and another woman join, another couple, let's say, and with it, so you've now got 6 people in the conversation. Within a matter of 20 seconds, 30 seconds, that will be very likely 2 single gender conversations. You just have to watch groups of ramblers or groups of, sort of walking through town, who are clearly a group together, or even sitting around a big table in a pub outdoors, as it were, a big outdoors table in the pub garden, and you'll just see this effect. The conversations become very gender specific, and we've shown this not only in the UK but in Iran with native Farsi speakers. So a completely different sort of culture, of course. And this, in some sense, goes back to the fact that the topics of conversation are very different in the two genders as much as anything.
Do exogenous characteristics include attractiveness and size?
Depends which gender you're talking about. So if you look at, so this comes out most clearly in things like personal ads, which we did a lot of work on some while ago. So what's very characteristic of the classic personal ads as they used to have in newspapers and magazines, personal columns, where what's very nice about those is that the person would specify something about themselves and then specify a list of things that they're looking for in the prospective partner. What you tended to find was that on the whole, women said very little about themselves other than their age and a word like attractive or something like that. But they would have a long list of things they were looking for in the other person, and you would see exactly the reverse in the men. So what seems to be happening is both sexes understand what the other is looking for, and adjust their declarations, if you like, accordingly. Now, this is partly a consequence of the fact that women are making much more complex decisions than this, and sort of romantic partners is just a sort of subset of the wider picture for friends in general. They're just in this context just a particular kind of friend. So we'll see exactly the same difference in criteria for friendship. Women are looking at trying to judge the person on many different criteria, which are mostly to do with things like their levels of commitment, their interests, and as well as what they have to offer in terms of lifestyle. Whereas, sad to say, for better or for worse, men's requirements come down to age and attractiveness and nothing else. Always feel I have to apologize on behalf of men, but it is a much more one-dimensional world, and it's in that sense it's much more anonymous. And we see this in very nicely demonstrated in profile pictures on say Facebook or anything like that. That we did a study of this a couple of years ago. If there's only two, if you sort of exclude all the profile pictures of motorbikes and baseball boots and weird things like that, and a picture of you with your mum, or you as a baby with your mum, or you with your baby, and just focus on same age people in the photograph. If there's only 2 people in it, it's almost certain to be a woman's Facebook page, and it will be 50-50 a male and 50-50 a female companion, which we take to be primarily, statistically at least, the romantic partner in the first case and the best friend forever in the second case. Men tend not to have 2 pictures, 2 people in a picture at all. It tends to be either one of them, or they'll have a lot, and it will tend to be 3 or 4 people sitting on top of the mountain at Machu Picchu. We've been walking up here. It'll be 5 guys crammed in the 5-a-side Goalmouth on Friday night after a game, or the guys in their kayaks on the lake, all pulled together. And it's sort of something activity based, and that distinction is very, very strong.
So just a question, this may be just going a bit deep, but have you any information about friendship sustainability for people who have experienced a high number of adverse childhood experiences? I guess this might be something for the Dunedin study, actually, from an early age. Any comments on that?
We have assiduously avoided doing anything on anybody under 18, simply because the ethics just gets a nightmare to deal with. The only study we ever did was on playgroups in children back in the later 90s, probably before ethics became serious, and all you had to do was ask the university registrar if it was all right if you had collected data in the university nursery or a school nearby. And that was, sort of always forthcoming. And that, aside from that, we've not done anything. That was very interesting because we looked at the size of playgroups that kids were involved in the playground, and then whip them out of the playground to give them tests on their mentalizing abilities. There's a very strong relationship between mentalizing abilities, which obviously develop across childhood and don't reach adult proportions until sort of mid to late teens. But there was a very strong relationship between mentalizing abilities and friendships, or the number of individuals they played with at the same time. But what's clear, I think, from the developmental literature is that if you like, the normal pattern of development that would happen all else equal can easily be destabilized by adverse events occurring. So it might be things like abuse, or it might be things like trauma from outside events, earthquakes, civil wars, or all the usual kinds of things. So there certainly is an impact, but it's not necessarily one of those things that every child is going to experience, I guess. And this goes back, I should add that this goes back perhaps to the fact that these kind of social skills that underpin friendships in the adult world, or relationships in the adult world generically, which are the skills of diplomacy, basically. They're the ability to understand other people's intentions, so this is mentalizing theory of mind, and inhibition, the ability to suppress your immediate selfish desires in the interests of the wider community or the other person in an interaction. Those two really lie at the core of our ability to handle large relationships. They're both highly dependent on bits of the brain, key bits of the brain up in the frontal lobe in particular. So we can show that both across species of primates, but also within individuals. There's a correlation between the size of core bits of the prefrontal cortex and both mentalizing abilities and inhibition capacities. So these are the famous Stanford marshmallow tests of the 1950s or whatever it was. They take a very long time to learn, and both the neuroimaging data from stuff we've done on emotional cue recognition in faces, but also the kind of stuff the developmental psychologists have done, really suggests very strongly that it takes about 25 years to become fully competent as an adult. And when I say fully competent, that's as competent as any of us ever are, which is not very, mostly, but enough to get by, as it were. It really is a long, slow process of learning. And if you don't have that learning process opportunity, you're not going to develop those skills effectively. So it's like you know, as I sometimes describe it, you know, what your genetics is giving you, your biological inheritance is the white lines on the rugby pitch and the rule book, right? And therefore specifying obviously, you know, who stands where and the kinds of jobs they do on the field. What it doesn't give you is how to win the match, because that only comes through practice. Say with your rule book in hand, you've got to go through this long period of time, and it's very much like the analogy I've always used is the sandpit of life. You know, you cannot get out of the sandpit of life in real life. If somebody kicks sand in your eyes, you have to find some way to deal with it. But the rule book doesn't tell you what the rule is, because there isn't a universal rule. It's because you have to be able to decide whether somebody did it by accident or deliberately, because that means you have, you know, your response should be very, very different. And you have to learn those very subtle skills. And that seems to be very, very time consuming. And if you don't have the opportunity for some reason, and or trauma, disease, whatever, forces you to have time out of the sandpit in isolation, you know, you're going to come back into the learning curve much later. And you know, perhaps as with many of these biological developmental things like body weight and so on, you know, you kind of may not ever quite catch up. It is a much more complicated issue than just you've got a big brain, therefore you have a lot of friends, because it's the quality of the friendship, and the quality of the friendship is determined how skilled you are at the kinds of cognitive abilities that underpin friendship, which come as a result of practice and learning, essentially. You can't teach them. It's very, well, you can teach them. you know, we do it all the time.
Rules of life. Would they be the unwritten rules of life?
They are. I mean, you know, parents do their best, you know, in the sense of, now share your toys with little Johnny, stop being selfish. And to some extent, it kind of works. But at the end of the day, you know, I think it's your experiences in the sandpit, as it were, with your peers that are really probably much more important. You know, to probably have outrage from all the parents and the audience. You know, it's what your peers do, or you do with your peers, is probably much more important developmentally than anything your parents do. All they do is try and keep you on the railway track.
So we've hit full time here, Robin. So I'd just like to thank you, Robin, for getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning to be with us. It's absolutely fabulous, the knowledge you've got, and this whole world and understanding of how we relate or don't relate to each other, really. So thank you again, Robin. And
Super.
we'll call it. Okay, bye-bye.